Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have three stories lined up for you today. The first one we're going to talk about is a new Windows 0 day that was dropped by a researcher known as Chaotic Eclipse. Both of them are called Yellow Key and Green Plasma, so we'll dive into the details of that one, as well as Verizon dropped their data breach investigation report. And so that one has some really good insight, really good information. So we'll go over some of the high-level details from that and statistics. And then finally, there was a CISA key leak from their GitHub repo. And so we'll kind of dive into what happened there and some mitigations as well. So stick around for those three stories. Now, the first one here, before we dive into it, we are going to be talking about some Microsoft technologies. So we have our standard disclaimer. Adam, if you want to go through that real quick.
Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. We record the show outside of work and self-fund the show. The opinions you're about to hear expressed are those of Adam Brewer and Andy Jha and do not necessarily reflect those of Microsoft Corporation.
All right. So let's get into it. These Windows 0 days were dropped by this security researcher named Chaotic Eclipse, and he's a little frustrated with Microsoft's vulnerability and bug reporting process. And so he dropped these 0 days in his GitHub in May. He also dropped 3 Defender 0 days in April, and we didn't talk about them at the time because they were patched pretty quickly. Blue Hammer, Red Sun, and Undefend, they're all patched now. In the April 2026 patch Tuesday, Blue Hammer was patched, and then just recently, May 21st, there was an out-of-band update for Defender that patched Red Sun and Undefend. But now he's dropped 2 more for Windows. And the first one is Yellow Key, which lets someone with a USB stick and physical access to a device bypass BitLocker encryption on Windows 11, Server 2022 or 2025. The second one is Green Plasma, and that's a privileged escalation flaw in CTFmon, which is a Windows text input service. And that lets a low privileged user work towards system level control. As of currently, no patch exists. Microsoft did assign a CVE for Yellow Key, which is CVE 2026 45,585. Okay, so some of the technical details here. Yellow Key, when BitLocker is in TPM mode only, so that just means that you're using just the TPM for BitLocker, not a PIN. So we'll talk about in some of the mitigations where there's like a TPM plus PIN, which is a pre-boot PIN. Most people don't do that for the most part. So when we get to the mitigations, we'll kind of dive into the pros and cons of that. But when it is in TPM mode, which is the default mode for most machines when they have BitLocker, the attack can abuse the Windows recovery environment or WinRAR. An attacker can put a specially crafted FSTX file on a USB drive, then boot the target device into recovery mode, and you hit a key combo and you get a full command prompt with the encrypted drive already unlocked. And it works because WinRAR's transactional NTFS replay can modify files on other volumes. With Green Plasma, CTFmon handles the language and input services, and then it also runs with elevated trust. So this particular flaw lets an unprivileged user create arbitrary memory section objects in locations that are trusted by the privileged system process. The security researcher published a proof of concept, and he left it intentionally incomplete. And he kind of said, hey, here's some of the details. I'm going to use this as a CTF, like a capture the flags for you guys to, try out. And so there's not enough detail out there right now for like a script kiddie or something like that to just take it and run and just get system. You need to actually complete the chain that he's kind of put out there on his GitHub. And so once it is finished, it does become a way to get system acquisition on a device. So right now, not enough detail, but it's out there on his GitHub and people are going to take a look at it. So with Yellow Key, Physical access is required for the device. So you do need to have that. You need to have USB drive active for that to get the specially crafted file from the drive to the system. You don't need any credentials. There's no recovery key, no special hardware, and it does work on any Windows 11 machine with TPM only. BitLocker as the default enabled. Green Plasma also requires local access. So it needs to establish some sort of low privileged foothold first into the system, like through phishing, compromised credentials, and unpatched vulnerability or something like that. And then you can use the vulnerability to escalate to system. So for some of the to-dos, specifically around Yellow Key, MSRC did publish a blog, which we'll link in the show notes, on some mitigations for this, because we did publish a CVE for this particular one. The first thing is on really sensitive machines, especially laptops that might leave the building that an attacker might get physical access to that you really want to protect. You might want to think about enabling the TPM plus pin, so the startup pin. When you do this, it does kill this particular attack. So it's dead in the water if you do that. Now, obviously, for a lot of regular users, this is something that will create kind of a barrier, right? Like it's another thing that they have to do before they get into the operating system. Most organizations don't do this, but I would consider looking at like sensitive systems, targeted systems, that this would probably be something that you might want to do. In the documentation from MSRC, they also included a mitigation script, which removes the program called autofstx.exe from a special run at boot inside the Windows recovery environment. And that also is required for the Yellow Key exploit to work. And if we remove that, it doesn't work anymore. So you can run the mitigation scripts if you have, like SCCM or MECM or some sort of automated management system to push out scripts to your devices. You can just do this en masse, and that also mitigates the issue here for Yellow Key. Obviously you want to look at any system that is running with BitLocker in TPM mode, which again, most organizations have that as default. Look at your physical security controls, lock screens, BIOS boot order restrictions, and cable locks for high risk endpoints. That was something I saw that as a tip, and I'm like, that makes perfect sense. Most of the time, orgs just leave their machines kind of out there, but if it is a high sensitive one, you might look at having a specific lock for it as well. Take a look at Patch Tuesday and kind of keep up to speed on those, because MSRC is actively working on a Yellow Key Green Plasma patch. So if you're following the patch notes, make sure that you prioritize it as soon as it hits. And then also you could monitor Chaotic Eclipse's GitHub. Their previous exploits were weaponized within a few days. So you can kind of set an alert if for some reason they drop another exploit out there. You can kind of keep up on what's happening, because he or she seems to be kind of just dropping these willy-nilly because they're mad at Microsoft's vulnerability report process, I guess.
My first reaction to this story is whoever Chaotic Eclipse is, they must be wealthy because there's a tremendous amount of money to be made here by going through the responsible disclosure process and disclosing these responsibly and waiting to get a response from Microsoft and then collecting those bug bounties as appropriate. And some of this is a difference of opinion. And we've seen this expressed recently where two people can look at the same thing and one person can say the sky is falling and another person can say, at this point, you've been owned so many different ways. Further ownage doesn't really matter all that much. And that's not to say here, because the security promise of BitLocker is if someone obtains physical access to your device, they still cannot decrypt the drive. And so if they can gain physical access to the device and decrypt the drive, the security promise of BitLocker isn't what it once was, for sure. Now, to be clear, that has to be in the hands of a reasonably skilled attacker, someone who's aware of this exploit and obviously motivated to do it. For the most part, someone physically stealing your laptop is probably not interested in the data on it. They just want the laptop. They're going to reimage it and sell it on eBay or whatever. So the chances of the laptop being stolen by someone who's motivated, again, it has to be a very targeted attack. And so when Andy talked through the mitigations, one of the things that made me raise an eyebrow was the suggestion to enable TPM plus PIN or TPM plus startup key, because at Microsoft, we still don't do that. My Surface Pro I have sitting here, my Surface laptop, I can boot them up from a dead sleep, not even sleep, but like fully powered off. And I'm not prompted for a PIN. I'll get straight to the Windows sign-in screen. It will scan my face and I'll be signed in with Windows Hello. So all this is to say, there are scenarios where that makes sense. That might make sense to deploy for your senior leadership team. Anyone who is, again, a journalist or someone who's in a high-risk industry probably should add some of these mitigation steps. And then you should also deploy the MSRC script, especially if you have tooling to do that easily, and remove this auto fstx.exe tool from your endpoints and just eliminate the risk there as well. So again, kind of an interesting story. Someone who has a difference of an opinion on how that responsible disclosure works and some of the decision-making Microsoft has made in that. Obviously, I'm not party to those discussions, so I cannot weigh in on them one way or the other. But it is interesting that someone is so bent out of shape about it, they're willing to financially limit their own income to make a point. And so I always do at least give a tip of the hat to anyone who's willing to put their money where their mouth is. When they believe in something so strongly, they're willing to take a financial impact to do that. So from that angle, I will take my hat off to Mr. or Mrs. or Miss Chaotic Eclipse. That said, as you know from watching the show, dear listeners and viewers, I am a very big fan of responsible disclosure. And I hold that up as the system working correctly. Just like in aviation, if you have an incident like, say, a engine number one shutdown and the aircraft needs to quickly return to the airport or go to the nearest diversion airport and it lands safely, that is not a failure, that's a success. That's where redundancy, that's where checklists, that's where training of the pilots and staying calm and executing the checklist and knowing what to do, that all worked. It kept people safe. Even though there was a failure, no one's safety was impacted. And same thing with security, vulnerability disclosures. Obviously, the goal is to ship perfect code. I say that all the time. That is not reality. We will have vulnerabilities disclosed and discovered, and probably more of them now with things like multi-model scanning harnesses and AI vulnerability detection. But bypassing the system because you don't agree with the process, I think hurts everyone in the long run, and it puts people at risk, especially because it's kind of your opinion of what's right and wrong versus the overall broad ecosystem, the 1.3 billion Windows devices in the world. To put them at risk because of your own opinions, I think is selfish. And so from that perspective, I disagree with the actions this person is taking. Again, but at least I will acknowledge the respect for leaving the money on the table to make the point. All that said, I think Andy nailed the takeaways. So if you have high-risk devices, go do these things. Another thing to consider in your threat modeling is if you get to a point in which sensitive data is just not generally downloaded to laptops, that's a good place to be. And if it is downloaded, if it's protected with, say, Purview information protection, and it's wrapped in another layer of encryption, which this does not defeat, then your most sensitive files are still safe. Even though they've gained general access to general decryption keys in the drive at large, those files are wrapped in a second layer of decryption that has not been defeated. So that's another thing to consider is if you are protecting your crown jewels with something like Purview information protection, that is still safe, even though the drive may be at large has been impacted. So something to consider as well. And then ultimately just limiting the amount of sensitive data on devices in the first place. We did an episode years ago based on a Swift on Security tweet that talked about how operational resilience and operational excellence was cybersecurity excellence. And if you are to the state where if I lose a laptop, I can quickly provision and issue a new one because everything is really stored in the cloud, there's very little local or unique to the device, well, that also helps you from these scenarios. The less that's interesting or useful on the device, the less that's attractive about breaking into the storage on the device in the first place. And that is also should be your North Star, is limiting how much and the kind of scenarios in which people need to put stuff on the device in the first place.
All right. So moving on to our second topic, I wanted to talk briefly about the new Verizon data breach investigations report. They put out their 2026 DBIR, which is their longest report in the entire 19-year history that they've been putting this out. I didn't know that they actually been putting it out
19
that
years
long.
already.
Yeah.
Wow.
But in this particular report, there were over 31,000 incidents that were documented, 22,000 confirmed breaches in 145 different countries. And for the first time ever, exploiting software vulnerabilities has surpassed stolen credentials as the most common way attackers get in. And I think that is, that alone is worth just discussing. We always talk about how doing the basics in cybersecurity hygiene, IT hygiene, just patching and, all that basic things are usually where most organizations can improve on. And so this report kind of highlights that now exploiting software vulnerabilities is the most common way.
Annie, I'm going to read that again. For the first time ever, exploiting software vulnerabilities has surpassed stolen credentials as the most common way attackers get in. We had said forever, I know we've said it on this show, former Microsoft CISO Brett Arsenault, famous for saying attackers don't break in, they log in. The thought process always was, well, don't let your credentials get stolen and you've solved 99% of the problem. Well, Verizon is now saying the opposite. They're saying attackers don't log in, they break in. That's the inverse of what we have said for years now. And so let's unpack this. But this should really grab your attention, listeners and viewers. This is a big deal.
Yeah.
I know it grabbed mine. Let's go.
So another thing that the report talked about is that third-party and supply chain breaches also jumped 60%, which now account for nearly half of all the breaches. So the threat landscape is shifting faster than a lot of organizations can kind of defend against. Some of the key statistics that I pulled out of the report are 31% of breaches are now via vulnerability exploitations. It was number 2 last year. It is now number 1. So we talked about that already. 48% of breaches involve a third party, which is up 60% year over year. And when I say it involves a third party, I mean like a vendor who is in your software supply chain. So part of your SBOM or part of your SaaS, vendor solutions. It could be a vendor who's hosting your data. It could also be a vendor with a connection into your environment. So those are kind of the 3 different categories that Verizon broke down in this particular report. And those 3 categories amount to 48% of all breaches. So some third party that is maybe the vendor was compromised, which then means you're compromised. And then another thing that I found was interesting is that only 23% of third-party organizations have fully remediated missing MFA on cloud accounts. That is a very, very low percentage. And that is the simplest baseline for, defending against identity attack. And it's not consistent across the vendor ecosystem. And then 43 days is the median time to fully remediate a vulnerability. And that number is going up, not down. Only 26% of CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities, which is their KEV list. We've talked about that before. Only 26% of the KEV vulnerabilities, meaning that they are being exploited today in the wild, were fully remediated in 2025, which is down from 38% the year before. So known exploited vulnerabilities are taking longer to remediate, as well as that they're just not getting remediated, as well as they were year to year. Last year, 38% of them were getting remediated. This year, only 26% are getting remediated. So these are numbers that are not trending in the right direction. So some of the details that we can go through here. The exploitation to breach window has compressed from months to hours for attackers, and that's mostly due to AI assisted attack tooling. Attackers are moving faster, defenders are patching slower, and credential
combination.
Yeah, that's a very bad combination. Credential abuse dropped to 13% of breaches as exploitations climbed to 31%. So you can see that inverse that Adam was talking about. The attackers are now breaking in instead of logging in. And third-party risk is now breach. Third-party risk is now a breach risk because supply chain compromises hit 48% of total breaches. So when a vendor is having a breach, that also means you're having a breach. Shadow AI is also a new leak category. Employee use of unapproved AI tools tripled to 45% of organizations. Sensitive data is being fed into unauthorized tools, which create a data leakage category that most security programs have zero coverage for. And then the other final thing that I will say is there was a whole section on mobile social engineering, which is up 40%. So we're talking SMS, WhatsApp, mobile apps are all increasingly where the phishing will land, not just in email. So, when it comes to like attack vector, unpatched public facing systems are going to be the ones that are most vulnerable. They're exploited at scale, automated scanning, exploitation within hours of a CVE disclosure. Compromised third-party vendors are also used as a pivot point into the target primary organization. So a couple of to-dos for your organization when it comes to kind of reading this. Number one, if it is a known exploited vulnerability, if it's on the CISA KEV list, you need to make sure that that is patched right now. Not like within 43 days. This is something that needs to be actively patched. And I've worked in many organizations with a vulnerability management program, and it's like you scan something and then that prints off a report, and then you got to go to like the system owners and, patch and reboot. And, each week or month, even, you're just kind of going through the same patterns of like, okay, we need to reboot this system. Like, it needs to be automated. It needs to be something that is just done without you thinking. Because if you're, maybe there's a few systems, like I do understand like legacy systems and servers, that are running very sensitive business critical tools. They can't go down for very long. I get that, but those should be the exception, not the default. The default should be, these are the patches that come out. This is the day that, like, just like my personal computer. Hey, it downloaded the patches. It's patch Tuesday. You have new things. It needs to restart. It needs to restart like right now. And I just restart it and it goes. Same thing with the phones. New patch comes out. Hey, we have a new one. You should have some sort of MDM solution that says you're out of cycle. You need to do this patch and restart your device. All of that should be automatic today. And if it's not, that's the first thing that you need to get to. And then, for those critical systems, you can have a particular readout that prints off, and you can look at it and boot it when you need to, have a downtime scheduled. And it should also be kind of a continuous evaluation, right? Like I think a point in time scan, you're going to see, 10,000 vulnerabilities, but then you do another point in time scan, you're going to see 11,000 vulnerabilities. And it's never going to go to zero. But you need to have some sort of system that ranks them by risk. So if you have really critical vulnerabilities that are on sensitive systems, or you have vulnerabilities that are deployed on systems org-wide, those are higher risk than if you just have a critical vulnerability that is on one system that no one uses. And so having that continuous scan, something like Defender Vulnerability Management, where it's continuously scanning, it gives you a risk posture for each one and tells you what are the priorities to patch. And then you can lower your risk score, maybe not the number of vulnerabilities, but your risk score and how, at risk you are for these exploitations. That is quality information and not just quantity. You also want to look at your third-party vendor risk, right? Like, do you know how many vendors have access to your environment? And what is your exposure if they get hit? This should be documented somewhere. Anyone that has access, maybe send them some sort of audit, that they have to fill out and make sure that they are using their tools correctly, and then monitor the access that they have in your environment. Build or update your shadow AI policy. Make sure that you're inventorying what tools your employees are actually using. Train them on, what's responsible use for AI. Provide them with something, and I'm sure Adam will have something to talk about here, but, provide them with a tool, because if they're not provided with some sort of AI tool, this is what's going to happen. They're going to go find, Chat GPT, or they're going to plug it into their phone or take a picture of it and plug it into their phone. And it's too easy to just siphon out corporate information if you're not providing them with something. Like, for example, at Microsoft, I just use Copilot because that's what they provide for me. It works very well for the work environment, and I don't have to use anything else. I don't have to copy it into anything else. So make sure that you're also extending that phish awareness training to mobile. Train users that SMS and messaging apps are also now valid attack channels, not just email. And yeah, so that's pretty much the to-dos. Adam, what are your thoughts on this report here?
Going into this episode, I would have still walked around and said attackers don't break in, they log in, and kind of continued down that same path. And maybe part of what's happening here is there is a little bit of a victory lap where we have hardened credentials to where that's no longer the most attractive or easiest pathway in. What's also interesting about this is this obviously was researched and probably mostly written before things like Claude Mythos, GPT 5.5 Cyber, Microsoft M- were announced or really starting to be used in any meaningful way. So when they talk about how the rate of vulnerabilities had increased, this is still kind of pre what we consider now the dawning of the AI age of vulnerability detection with modern, tools like Mythos, GPT 5.5, Microsoft M-. That's changing the ballgame here as well. And so when I read this, and it's already saying that is becoming the biggest threat, and we can think of this as an artifact before kind of the current environment, my big takeaway here is this isn't getting any easier. This is only going to get worse. And Andy, as you kind of walk through this, you talked about how we have to take friction out of this process. You have to look, you really need to get like a process engineer, someone who's good about looking at a process, finding the critical path, finding the bottlenecks and eliminating them. Because I can think back to my days in IT when things like Heartbleed came out. And I can remember the fire drill of trying to respond to Heartbleed inside my environment. It was to drop everything and go attack that. And anymore, Heartbleed type vulnerabilities are getting announced fairly regularly. And so that needs to be something where we have a documented process for how to handle. We have a checklist effectively. Like I just talked about the aviation example where, there's an engine out. What do? We run the checklist. We're trained for this. We've done it in the simulator. Have you done a tabletop exercise? Do you have a checklist? Is everyone trained on it? This shouldn't be a fire drill. This should be normal. How do we respond to this? We follow the patching procedure. We follow the 0-day procedure, whatever you have in your environment. And so we have to continue to get better at this and reduce this trend where attackers are exploiting these vulnerabilities faster and we're patching slower. We got to patch faster too. That's the only way we're going to deal with this, or the problem's going to only exacerbate. And especially, I've been warning on the show for the last several weeks, I think we have a coming tsunami of vulnerability announcements and their accompanying patches. And we'll get through that tsunami together if we're prepared and we have a plan for how we address it. I see a lot of organizations that are not ready for it. They're not ready to patch at the scale and speed they have to. And so these are where things like Windows Auto Patch come into play. There's still way too many organizations that are manually testing and approving every single little patch for their Windows PCs. And that needs to be truly, we have an automated process where this gets promoted through these deployment rings at this stage. And unless there's a big problem where we press the big red stop button, we just let it proceed through the deployment rings as planned. And that is all automated and scheduled and predictable in how it goes down. And we should only be deviating from that if there's a reason to deviate from it. And I get that that's probably not your biggest challenge. It's more what you mentioned, Andy, legacy systems and servers, but you have to find ways to streamline those too. You can't be going around begging people to reboot servers all the time and finding a window. There just has to be a defined window of when we do it, even if it's a system that never goes down, because that's just not reality of the world we live in now. So there has to be some sort of high availability, some way to do that. And I think your callouts were great. I mean, if nothing else, get that Kev list done from CISA.
Yeah.
Anything that's known to be exploited, get buttoned up there. That's a great place to start.
Okay, so our final story is this interesting one. CISA had some credentials that were exposed in a public GitHub repo for 6 months. So The backstory is there was a contractor that was working for CISA, and that's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is like the official government agency for the U.S. government. This contractor accidentally pushed about 844 megabytes of sensitive government data to a public GitHub repo and named it, ironically, private dash CISA. I got a little chuckle of that too. And it sat there from November 2025 until May 2026. A tool called Git Guardian, which is an automated scanning tool, caught it and then verified it wasn't a hoax and reported it. CISA took the repo down within 26 hours of notification, but the credentials had been live and accessible for roughly 6 months. And researchers confirmed that the AWS Gov Cloud keys in the repo were still active and working at high privilege levels when they tested them. So in the repo, there were plain text passwords in CVSV files, some SSH private keys, AWS Gov Cloud Access tokens, including a file literally named Important AWS Tokens, Kubernetes manifest, Terraform infrastructure code, CI/CD workflow files, Argo CD configs, internal documentation backups, and build deploy scripts. So not just credentials, but a complete attacker's map of what those credential access and how the infrastructure is built. The CISA contractor committed the secrets into Git on a personal GitHub account instead of pulling them from a secret manager at runtime. GitHub does have native protections designed to catch this. The repo's commit logs show that those protections were deliberately disabled. So that's also interesting. AWS GovCloud is a restricted environment for US government data. High privilege access there is a potential entry point into the federal infrastructure and software supply chain tooling. The Git Guardian researcher who found it said it was one of the worst leaks he's seen in 9 years working in government cybersecurity. So yeah, I think the biggest thing here is also the credentials were reportedly still valid for 48 hours after CISA was notified. It was taken down. The repo was taken down after 26 hours, but some of those credentials were still working. So in the to do, number one, this is pretty obvious, but it needs to be said because some people, some developers, some orgs make this mistake still. Don't store your secrets in Git. Use a secret manager. AWS Secrets Manager, HashiCorp Vault, Azure Key Vault. So there's key vaults out there that you can use and store these secrets in. You don't want to inject those credentials at runtime. This is something that is standard practice, should be a non-negotiable, and this should be just standard practice for all developers. You should also enable GitHub's native secret scanning on all repos. So if someone on your team disabled it, that's worth investigating immediately. You should also scan your existing repos, public or private, for committed secrets right now. There are tools out there to do it, like this Git Guardian, Trufflehog, Git Leaks. There's a bunch of different tools that you can scan. Make sure that you find something and scan your repos for committed secrets if they're living there right now. And then just like before in the Verizon data report, make sure that you audit your contractor and third-party developer access. Make sure that your contractors are following the same secrets hygiene policies that your internal staff has to follow, and then verify it. So don't just assume that they're doing it, that they tell you that they're doing it. Make sure that you're verifying. And then finally, this is something that I never really thought about either, because this is like the checklist, right? Like the
recurring theme of the show, apparently.
yeah, something happened. What do? Have a credential rotation playbook ready. So if you need to mass rotate your keys, can you do that today? Like if someone said, hey, I got all the keys to all of your development code, your CI/CD pipeline, and you have to rotate all your code, all your keys in your code, can you do that? And how fast can you do it? Because CISA's keys were supposedly still alive 48 hours after notification. And that in today's world is probably too slow. You should be able to like hit a button, automate, boom, rotate the keys, the code still works, and we're off to the races. So if you're using a key vault, that should do it as well. So make sure that you're thinking about that. If that comes down to it and you had to mass rotate all your keys, could you do that and have that playbook ready?
I feel like there's got to be more to this story.
I'm sure there is.
This feels fishy, but wow.
It's a facepalm moment, right?
If you, for those listening to the show on the audio podcast, I was very visually doing the facepalm. And I think that's why Andy kept laughing during the report, because I just, holy smokes, listeners, what a leak. But I don't think I have a lot to add here, Andy. Some great to-dos for our listeners and viewers. Use the secrets manager, scan your code for secrets. There shouldn't be a file literally named important AWS tokens. That file should not exist.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, guys. This
Plain
is
text passwords in a
gals.
CSV file. Like, that's crazy.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's nuts. And there are tools to help with this. And then, yeah, I love the call out for the playbook, because that's such a recurring theme on the show is, that reference to aviation, but it's such a good example of if we have a playbook and something happens, we don't have to think or panic. We just do it, and we've practiced it, and we can execute that at scale and speed. We just have to continuously work on improving our response times to everything. And this is another example, perfect example, Andy. Someone's got all our keys. What do? Well, we've got a plan for that, and here's what it is. And we go execute. So, wow, that's a heck of a story and a great one to end on.
The funny thing is, I was actually in aviation for a little while. The things that would happen during an emergency, we call them EPs, emergency procedures. And you don't get into an airframe until you have every single EP memorized word for word from the book and practiced, because you need to know them. Like, there's no time to really think. Now, I'm not saying that you should have like your entire like emergency playbook memorized, but it should be somewhere along the lines like, I know exactly where I need to go when this happens. We have a plan for it. So treat it like, an emergency procedure for an airframe. It's like engine on fire. Like, what are the 8 steps that you need to do when your engine's on fire? It's not like, oh, I need to take out the checklist. Like, you already know, you've practiced it multiple times. Your hand, like, we used to like say, okay, we got to turn off the engine first or something like that, right? Like, you physically reached up where the knob was, even if you're practicing it like visually in your chair, reach up and then, pull the throttle back, then we would push the throttle with our hand in the air. So you're practicing the motions, you're repeating the things. And so what you need to do when the proverbial, stuff hits the fan. You're not just like running around like a chicken with your head cut.
It's a really good point, because what do people always say who have been through something like that in commercial aviation? They constantly say, the crew was so calm. The crew was so professional. They knew what to do. They were so calm. They just executed. And I'll admit, I've been out of IT for a long time now, almost a decade. But when we had stuff like this come through, it was anything but calm. It was chaotic. The sky was falling. There were people yelling at each other. There were high emotions. There was high drama. It was the opposite of how those were described. And I get cybersecurity, IT, aviation, very different things, but there's things we can learn from other industries. And I think getting to that state where Andy is talking about, where you've practiced it and you are poised throughout execution of it, can really help everyone go through these events, which could be that CISA was all hands on deck when this got announced. There were some tense moments. There were some raised voices. And how can we make that so everyone just knows their position and what they need to do and what steps they need to take? I think that's a good North Star for a lot of common potential cybersecurity scenarios, and a good North Star to work towards in your organization.
Good points. All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. The links to the topics that we talked about will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just email us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.